Back in the year 22, I was living down in the Bay Area, specifically in the busy city of Oakland, California. It was a pretty stressful time in my life, and I was working long hours at my job. Because of my schedule, I did not get to see my family very often, but I decided to take a weekend trip to visit my parents who lived up in the town of Eureka, which is way up in Northern California. Now, if you have ever driven Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, you know exactly how beautiful it is during the day. You have these massive redwood trees on one side of the road and the beautiful Pacific Ocean on the other side. But at night, that beauty completely vanishes, and the highway turns into a genuine nightmare. There are incredibly long stretches of road with absolutely no other cars, no cell phone service, and barely any streetlights. It is a very ominous and lonely place to be when the sun goes down. I ended up leaving my parents' house in Eureka around 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening. Looking back, that was a really bad decision. I really should have just stayed the night at their house and driven back to Oakland on Monday morning. But I had an early shift at work and figured I would rather just knock out the drive so I could sleep in my own bed. Those turned out to be famous last words. The first couple of hours of the drive were completely fine. The highway eventually narrowed down to a simple 2-lane road, which is how most of rural Highway 101 is once you get north of the Bay Area. I was making decent time, and the traffic was non-existent. But somewhere around the small coastal town of Trinidad, the fog started rolling in from the ocean. Now, fog on that part of the California coast is not unusual at all. It is actually extremely common. But this particular fog was different. Within about 5 minutes, the visibility went from completely clear to barely being able to see 20 feet ahead of my car. It was incredibly bad, much worse than I am even describing right now. I had to slow down to about 35 miles per hour just to keep my car on the road. The smart thing to do would have been to pull off onto the shoulder and wait for the fog to clear up, but the problem was that there really are not a lot of safe places to stop along that stretch of the highway. There are steep drop-offs on one side and thick forest on the other, and honestly, I just wanted to get home. I figured if I just took it slow and kept my eyes on the white fog line, I would be totally fine. But here is the thing about extremely thick fog, and anyone who has driven in Northern California knows this. It completely messes with your sense of space and distance. You cannot see any landmarks. You cannot tell how far you have gone. You cannot see what is coming up ahead of you. It is incredibly disorienting, especially when you are already tired from a long weekend of socializing. After about another half hour of driving through this silent white void, I saw a figure standing off the side of the road. I say figure because that is genuinely what it looked like at first. It was just a dark, indistinct shape on the shoulder of the highway, maybe 50 feet ahead of me. As I got closer, I could see that it was definitely a person. Based on the height and the build, it looked like a man, and he was just standing there facing the road. He was not walking. He was not waving his arms to flag me down like he needed a lift. He did not even have a phone in his hand. He was genuinely just standing completely still, staring directly out at the empty highway. I slowed down even more as I passed him, because I was terrified that he might suddenly step out into my lane, and I would clip him with my passenger side mirror. But he did not move at all. He did not even turn his head to watch my car go by, which was incredibly creepy. I got a really good look at his face as I drove past, and there was nothing about him that struck me as unusual or threatening. He just looked like a normal guy in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing dark clothes. My first thought was that maybe his car had broken down somewhere nearby, and he was just waiting for a tow truck or a ride, which would make complete sense. Except for the fact that I had not passed any other cars on the shoulder for miles, and there was absolutely no reason for a person to be standing in that exact spot, facing that exact direction. There was literally nothing out there. I actually thought about turning around to ask if he needed help, but something deep in my gut told me that something was very wrong with this situation. I decided it was not my problem, so I just kept driving. But then, about 10 minutes later, I saw him again. I am not exaggerating when I say this. It was the exact same guy. He had the same build, the same dark clothing, and the exact same stance on the shoulder of the road. The only difference was that this time, he was standing on the left side of the highway instead of the right side. Everything else about him was absolutely identical. I actually said out loud to myself, "What the hell is going on?" There was physically no way this guy could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only car on the road, and there were no cross streets, no shortcuts, and no other paths he could have taken on foot through the dense redwood forest. The only logical explanation was that this was a completely different person who just happened to look exactly like the first guy and was standing in the exact same weird posture. I did not want to look at him as I passed, but I could not help myself. I had to confirm if it was actually the same person, and after getting a close look, I was dead certain it was him. But this time the guy actually locked eyes with me as I drove past. I could not look away fast enough. Seeing his head suddenly snap to meet my eyes was incredibly freaky, and I instantly regretted making eye contact with him. I sped up a little bit, not too much because the fog was still incredibly thick, and I did not want to drive off a cliff, but I sped up enough that I was pushing 45 miles per hour. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was happening back there on the highway. But the fog got even worse after that. It was so thick that I could barely see the yellow center line on the road, so I had no choice but to slow back down. I was having a really hard time thinking straight. My head was pounding, and my eyes were burning from staring so hard into the mist. I figured it was just the combined effect of how tired I was, how stressful it was to drive in these conditions, and the weird encounter I had just experienced. I kept trying to rationalize the whole thing in my head, telling myself that it was just two different people who looked similar, but I just could not make sense of it. My train of thought was abruptly interrupted, though, because not even 3 minutes later, my headlights exposed something else in the road ahead. There was another person standing up there, but this time he was not on the shoulder. He was standing directly in the middle of my lane. I had no choice but to slam on my brakes and bring the car to a complete stop, which is exactly what I did. This time, the person was wearing a hood that completely covered his face, so I could not see what he looked like, but I had this horrible feeling that it was the exact same guy. He did not move a single inch, which is when I started to get really genuinely terrified. We were at a complete standstill on a dark, foggy highway. Even though I could not see his face under that hood, I could feel him staring directly at me through my windshield. I had no idea what to do. I flashed my brights at him a few times, hoping he would move out of the way or at least react, but he did not even flinch. I decided to put my car in reverse, thinking I could back up and turn around. But when I looked in my rearview mirror, my heart stopped. There was someone standing directly behind my car. They were slowly creeping toward my rear bumper, coming out of the thick fog behind me. I yelled out in pure panic, put the car back into drive, and prepared to do whatever I had to do to escape. I was completely boxed in, but I did not care about the traffic laws anymore. There was an actual threat to my life right there in front of me. I pulled the steering wheel hard to the right, crossing over into the opposite lane to swerve around the guy who was blocking the road in front of me. He did not even try to move as I sped past him, and for a split second, I thought I was finally in the clear. But then, something hit my car from behind. It was not just a light tap or a little bump. It was extremely violent. The entire back end of my car jolted violently to the right, and I heard this awful loud crunching sound of metal twisting against metal. I fought to maintain control of the steering wheel and just kept driving, thinking that I had somehow gotten into a crash with another vehicle that I had not seen in the fog. But when I checked my mirrors, there was absolutely nothing behind me. The road was completely empty. There were no headlights, no cars, and not even those people. It was as if they had completely vanished into thin air. As if the situation was not already terrifying enough, that realization made it so much worse. I did not stop to investigate. I just sped off as fast as I possibly could given how heavy the fog was. By the time I finally reached the Highway 101 interchange, the fog suddenly cleared and I could actually see the road again. For the first time in hours, I felt my brain starting to relax. But the more I calmed down and thought about what had just happened, the more I started to doubt myself. And this might sound surprising to hear, but I genuinely concluded that I must have hallucinated the entire thing. Here is why. I had been driving for almost 4 hours straight. I was completely exhausted. I had been staring into a thick, white wall of fog for God knows how long, completely alone on a dark, isolated highway. An extremely vivid hallucination did not seem that far-fetched under those conditions. Why the hallucination was so incredibly specific was beyond me, but I felt there was no other logical explanation for seeing those figures, or feeling a crash that did not actually happen. By the time I finally made it back to my apartment in Oakland, I was ready to just sleep the whole thing off and try to forget it ever happened. But as I walked around to the back of my car to grab my bags, I stopped dead in my tracks. My rear bumper was completely destroyed. There was a massive deep dent running almost the entire width of the bumper. This meant that whatever had hit me had struck my car way harder than I initially realized. It also meant that I had actually been hit by something, meaning I had not hallucinated a single thing. I stood there staring at the damage for about 5 minutes in complete shock. There was absolutely no paint transfer on the bumper, which there definitely would have been if I had been hit by another vehicle. But if it was not another car that had hit me, I had absolutely no idea what could have caused such massive structural damage to my bumper. I did end up calling the local police department to report what I had seen, but it was really just to get the information out there in case anyone else had reported something similar. I have thought about that night a lot over the past 4 years. I have gone through every single possible explanation in my head. What I have eventually accepted is that I might have hallucinated the figures on the road, and in my panicked attempt to drive away, I must have backed into a guardrail post or a mile marker without realizing it. But the thing that always gets me is this. I can accept having a hallucination, but for me to hallucinate one specific thing, which was the figures, while actually experiencing a real physical car crash at the exact same moment, is something I have a very hard time accepting. The fact that there was real, physical damage to my car has always made me believe that there was something far more malicious and real waiting for me out in the fog that night. Now, while driving on a dark, foggy highway can make you feel completely isolated, sometimes you do not even have to leave your own neighborhood to find yourself in a situation where the world around you suddenly stops making sense. This next story took place just this past spring break, which was only a few weeks ago. I am currently a senior in college, and like I always do during breaks, I went back to my hometown to spend the week with my parents. The major problem with going back home, though, is that there is genuinely nothing to do there. I grew up in one of those typical suburban towns that is technically located close to a major city, but it does not have any of the actual benefits of being in a city. There are no bars, no nightlife, and absolutely nothing within walking distance of my parents' house. When I am away at school, I always have a busy schedule and things to do, but back home, the town feels like an absolute ghost town. The other issue I ran into was that none of my high school friends shared the same spring break schedule as me. I only keep in touch with about 4 or 5 people from my high school days, and every single one of them was either still taking classes or had already finished their spring break earlier in March. This meant I was looking at a full week of sitting around, doing absolutely nothing, which I was not thrilled about at all. I should also mention that around this time, I had been trying to cut back on a few habits, specifically nicotine and alcohol. I knew that having a week of pure boredom at home was either going to make my cravings much worse, or it was going to give me a perfect opportunity to reset my body. I decided to use the time productively and committed to working out every single day. My plan was to lift weights in the morning and go for a long run in the afternoon. I figured keeping myself physically active would prevent me from getting stuck in my own head. That is how I ended up going out for a run on a random Tuesday afternoon. As I was getting ready, I remembered a specific running loop that I used to do all the time back when I ran cross country in high school. The loop is exactly 3 miles long from start to finish, beginning and ending right at my parents' driveway. The route takes you through the quiet suburban neighborhood for about a quarter of a mile, and then it cuts directly into a wooded trail that winds through a small patch of forest. Eventually, the trail spits you back out onto the pavement about a single block away from my house. I have probably run that exact loop 1,000 times between my freshman and senior years of high school. The woods were always the absolute best part of the run. Running on hard asphalt really destroys your knees over time, but the dirt path through the trees is soft and forgiving. It is also incredibly quiet in those woods, which is exactly what I look for when I want to clear my mind. I headed out of the house around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was not scheduled to set for another couple of hours, so I was not worried about running in the dark. But the second I stepped outside onto the front porch, I noticed the fog. I do not even know how to describe it, other than to say it was thick in a way I had never seen before in my entire life. I have lived in this town for over 20 years, and I have absolutely no memory of ever seeing fog like this. It looked almost fake, like a scene out of a low-budget horror movie, or one of those lo-fi study videos you see on YouTube. Anything that was further than 30 or 40 feet away simply dissolved into a thick gray haze. I seriously considered skipping my run and just staying inside, but I managed to talk myself out of it. I told myself that the trail through the woods is a direct, straight shot. It is just one single path with absolutely no forks, offshoots, or diverging paths. I knew those woods so well that I could probably navigate them blindfolded, so getting lost was not even a realistic possibility. I strapped on my Garmin watch so I could track my pace and overall distance, started my workout, and took off. I did the quick quarter-mile run through the quiet neighborhood streets, and then entered the tree line. Once I was inside the woods, the fog seemed even thicker. This made sense because the dense canopy of the trees was blocking out whatever remaining daylight was left in the sky. I could barely see 15 or 20 feet ahead of me on the path, but since the trail was so well defined, it was still very easy to follow. For the first mile and a half of the run, everything felt completely normal. I was running at a slightly slower pace than usual, just to make sure I did not trip over any tree roots in the low visibility, but it was not a big deal. I remember checking my watch right at the 1 mile mark, and then checking it again when I hit a mile and a half. Everything was tracking perfectly, but the issues started when I approached what should have been the 2.5 mile mark. At that specific point in the loop, I should have been getting very close to the end of the wooded trail. The dirt path is supposed to curve sharply to the left, take you up a small incline, and then transition back onto the paved neighborhood road. I know that section of the trail by heart. I know every single twist and turn of those woods, but when I glanced down at my watch and saw that I had run 2.5 miles, I was still deep in the middle of the dense forest. I figured my watch was just acting up. It was at least 4 years old at that point, so I assumed the GPS signal was getting blocked by the heavy tree cover and the thick fog. This seemed like a perfectly logical explanation, so I decided to just keep running forward, assuming I was not as far along the trail as my watch claimed. But then I looked down and saw that I had passed the 3 mile mark. This was when I knew that something was seriously wrong. 3 miles is the entire length of the loop, including the neighborhood sections. At 3 miles, I should have been standing in my parents' driveway, or at least on the street. Instead, I was still completely surrounded by dense trees on both sides of the path, with absolutely no signs of the exit in sight. I stopped running and came to a halt. I am not a paranoid person by nature, and I do not believe in the supernatural. I knew there had to be some kind of rational, scientific explanation for what was happening. I stood there trying to catch my breath and think through the situation, but I genuinely could not figure it out. There was only one trail in these woods. I knew that for a fact. There were no alternate paths or places where I could have taken a wrong turn. The only way I could have gotten lost was if I had physically stepped off the trail and walked deep into the thick brush, which I obviously had not done. I checked my watch again, and the distance read 3.1 miles. The strange thing was that the number kept ticking up, even though I was standing completely still. That confirmed my theory that the GPS was having a major malfunction. Since the watch was useless, I had to make a decision. I could either keep running forward and hope the trail eventually ended, or I could turn around and retrace my steps back to the entrance. The second option seemed much safer and smarter. If I just ran back the way I came, I would eventually hit the neighborhood street where I started, and I knew exactly how to get home from there. I turned around and started running back in the opposite direction. The fog had somehow gotten even worse while I was standing there. It was so thick now that I had to slow my pace to a light jog, just to make sure I did not accidentally run off the dirt path and hit a tree. After running for about another mile, which put my total distance at around 4 miles, I heard a sound. Like I said before, It is usually completely silent in those woods because the forest is too small to support any large wildlife. So hearing a sound out there was not something my brain was prepared for, but the actual sound itself was so much worse than anything I could have imagined. It was a noise I had never heard in my life. The best way I can describe it is like a deep, low moan, but that does not fully capture it. It was lower than a moan, more like a mechanical drone, and it fluctuated in volume. It would rise up in pitch and intensity, then dip back down, and then swell up again. It sounded almost like an air raid siren, but it was clearly coming from a human throat. I cannot stress enough how completely wrong and unnatural it sounded. It did not sound like someone calling out for help, and it did not sound like someone who was in pain. It was just this continuous wavering, mechanical noise that seemed to have no human purpose. I immediately started running as fast as my legs could carry me. But you have to remember that I had already been running for over 4 miles at this point. I was physically exhausted, and the pure terror of the situation was making my heart race and draining my energy even faster. The faster I tried to run, the more tired I became, and the more panicked I felt. And the worst part was that the sound did not stop. No matter how fast I ran down the path, the source of that horrible noise was matching my speed perfectly. Every time I glanced back over my shoulder, I could not see anything through the thick wall of gray fog. It was just an empty path of white haze behind me. I ran with that endless sound following me for what felt like an absolute eternity. I had no other choice but to keep pushing forward. It was without a doubt the most terrifying moment of my entire life. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the trees begin to thin out. I burst out of the woods and onto the paved neighborhood street, where I collapsed onto the curb, nearly throwing up from pure exhaustion. Even out here on the street, the fog was still incredibly thick. I forced myself to stand up, turned around, and looked back toward the entrance of the wooded trail. To my absolute horror, there was a figure standing directly in the middle of the path, just a few feet past the tree line. I say figure because I do not know what else to call it. It was a massive, dark silhouette. It was significantly taller than me, and I am over 6 feet tall. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. It was not moving toward me, and it was not moving away. It was just standing there, watching me. I could physically feel its gaze locking onto me. The only sign of life was that it was slowly and gently swaying from side to side. If it had not been for that subtle swaying motion, I probably would have convinced myself that I was just staring at a strange tree trunk. The horrible droning sound had finally stopped, but I did not wait around to see what would happen next. I turned around and sprinted the final block back to my house without looking back a single time. That incident happened a few weeks ago, and I am back at college now. But I have not been able to stop thinking about that night. I cannot get the image of that massive black shape out of my head, and that terrible mechanical sound still haunts my dreams. I told my parents about what happened, and they both tried to convince me that it was probably just some incredibly tall local teenager who was hiding in the woods to play a prank on runners. But I do not believe that for a second. There is no way a human being could make that kind of sound while running through dense woods at the exact same speed as me. I do not know what was waiting in those woods that evening, and I honestly do not think I ever want to find out. It is one thing to face an unknown figure in the woods near your house, but it is another thing entirely when you are out on the open water, completely exposed, with nowhere to hide. This brings us to our third story, which took place about 6 years ago, in the late part of September. My good friend Edwin and I had been talking about taking a kayaking trip out to Willapa Bay for almost 2 years, and we finally managed to lock in a weekend, where we were both free to actually do it. If you are not familiar with the geography of Washington, Willapa Bay is a massive tidal estuary located on the state's coast. It is about 25 miles long and is mostly comprised of commercial oyster farms and a large national wildlife refuge. On a clear, sunny day, it is honestly one of the most quiet and peaceful places you could ever visit. But the weekend we chose to go was definitely not a clear day. Neither Edwin nor I were beginners when it came to water sports. We had both been paddling kayaks since we were young kids, and Edwin had actually worked as a professional kayak guide for a couple of summers during his college years. We knew exactly how to handle ourselves on the water, and we understood safety protocols. I think that is an important detail to share, because I do not want anyone to think we were just a couple of inexperienced city kids who got scared because we did not understand how water currents or coastal weather worked. We launched our kayaks early on Saturday morning from a public access point near the small town of Nakota. The fog was incredibly thick when we set off, but we assumed it would burn off by mid-morning once the sun got higher in the sky, which is usually what happens on the Washington coast. We had a reliable GPS unit, a backup compass, and plenty of emergency gear. Our plan was to paddle across the bay toward Long Island, do some bird watching, eat some lunch on one of the sandy bars, and then head back to Nakota before the afternoon tide shifted. The first hour of the paddle was completely fine. The heavy fog muffled all the sounds around us in that unique way that coastal fog always does. It felt like we were paddling through a giant cloud of cotton, and the water was incredibly calm and silent. We could not see more than 40 feet in front of our kayaks, but we made sure to stay close together and checked our compass headings every few minutes to stay on course. It was not a big deal at all, but around 9 o'clock in the morning I heard something. It was a distinct splashing sound. At first, I assumed it was just Edwin. We were paddling in a loose tandem formation, with him about 15 feet to my left side, and I figured he had just adjusted his paddling stroke or hit a small wave. But when I looked over at him, I saw that his paddle was resting flat across his lap. He looked over at me and asked if I had heard that sound too, and I nodded my head to confirm that I had. We both stopped paddling entirely and just drifted in our kayaks, listening closely to the quiet water. It was the distinct sound of oars. I say oars specifically because oars and kayak paddles make very different noises when they enter the water. We were using double-bladed paddles, but this sound was definitely the rhythmic clanking and splashing of single oars being rowed from a boat. And the sound did not seem to be very far away from us at all, maybe 100 feet off to our right side. Edwin suggested that it was probably just another boater out on the bay, which seemed like a very reasonable explanation. There were other kayakers who frequented the area, and local fishermen would occasionally go out in small motorized boats or rowboats to check on their crab pots. The fog was so thick that we could not see them, but sound travels incredibly well over open water, especially in foggy conditions. Sometimes things can sound like they are right next to you when they are actually far away. We waited for a minute, expecting the other boater to either call out to us or emerge from the gray haze. Standard safety etiquette on the water when visibility is low is to make some noise or announce your position so you do not,